In the late 1980s, a Canadian artillery genius harboring a grudge against the West found himself in the deserts of Iraq working hand in hand with Saddam Hussein, which sounds terrifying. His goal, though, that was to build the biggest gun the world had ever seen, a weapon so enormous and so powerful that it could fire satellites into space. For real, or launch chemical warheads across continents. Codenamed Project Babylon, it was equal parts science experiments, vanity project, and, well, the doomsday machine. And for a while, it looked like this thing might actually work. But when you're smuggling giant cannon barrels across borders, paying engineers in briefcases of cash, and teasing foreign spies with boasts about your space gun, you tend to make enemies. Deadly, dangerous enemies. This is the wild, conspiratorial, and very, very real story of how Saddam nearly got his hands on a superweapon, and how the world, terrified of what that might mean, well, stopped it. The man who dreamed too big. To understand how a Supergun project found its way to Saddam's Iraq, we first need to meet Gerald Bull, the man behind the dream. Bull was not your average arms engineer. He was a child prodigy of ballistics, a Canadian whiz kid who had been obsessed with all things shooty since pretty much the moment he was born. From early on, he was captivated by a grand idea. Could you fire a projectile into space using a big-ass cannon? Well, most experts scoffed at the notion, but Bull was determined to prove that it was possible. In the 1960s, as a young professor at McGill University, he spearheaded a research program that would make him a legend in certain circles. It was called Project HARP, HARP standing for High Altitude Research Project, and it was nothing short of spectacular. With quiet backing from the US Army, Bull took two 16-inch naval guns and welded them end-to-end to create a single 118-foot-long artillery piece, and then installed the resulting monster on the Caribbean island of Barbados. The so-called HARP space gun began thundering shots into the sky that rattled windows across the island. Using fin-stabilized projectiles, Bull called them marlet shells, Bull's team fired dozens of rounds to the fringes of space. In November 1966, the project peaked, both literally and figuratively, when one of the gun-launched projectiles reached an altitude of 111 miles, a world record for any gun-fired object. Now, for context here, outer space is generally agreed to start at the Kármán line, which is only 62 miles up, so they got well over that. Flushed with success following all of that, Bull then envisioned even bigger cannons and rocket-boosted shells that could reach even higher altitudes. Basically, he argued, a cannon had certain advantages over a rocket. A gun's fuel, the explosive propellant, delivers a massive instant impulse, and its barrel provides inherent accuracy and guidance. The drawbacks, of course, pretty enormous, chiefly the 10,000 Gs of acceleration that would crush most payloads, not to mention any hypothetical astronaut. It's going to be a bad time. Like a bull that had seen a red flag waving before it, however, he kept his eyes on the prize. By the mid to late 1960s, he was drawing up plans for a big boy 32-inch caliber space gun that he envisioned as being able to lob small satellites into orbit quickly, cleanly, and above all else, really cheaply. This was his life's big idea, and he pursued it with an evangelical zeal. Yet reality came crashing down in 1967. Funding for Project HARP was abruptly cut off. The Canadian government grew uncomfortable with how overtly military Bull space research appeared, and the American scientific establishment was putting its money on rockets and not on giant guns. Practically overnight, Bull's grand experiment was given the axe. The sudden end of HARP devastated him. Colleagues recall that he took it as a personal betrayal. After pouring his soul into the space gun project, he felt cast aside by the very governments that he thought were helping him. Now, if Bull couldn't get government support for his peaceful space launcher, well, he decided to go private and go military. In the 1970s, therefore, he transformed himself into a freelance weapons designer and arms dealer. Possibly the coolest job title ever. Adapting his high-altitude research into cutting-edge artillery technology, Bull founded a company, Space Research Corporation, straddling the Canada-Vermont border, and began selling advanced munitions to anyone who would bankroll his work. He also developed the GC-45 howitzer, a 6.1-inch gun with extended range that outclassed standard NATO artillery. He also sold thousands of them to countries like Israel, which used them in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and even countries that were on NATO's naughty list, such as still apartheid South Africa, China, Iran, and Iraq. We cannot stress enough the extraordinary range of the GC-45. When fed with Bull specialist base burn shells, a type that continues to burn propellant after it leaves the barrel, creating an area of low pressure behind the shell that reduces drag in flight, they could reach for a range of 24.6 miles. Now for comparison, the L-118 light gun, then and now the UK's go-to field piece, it tops out at a range of 12.8 miles, even when using base bleed shells. The M777 howitzer, the US equivalent, which also happens to be a British design, can reach out to 14.6 miles, firing its standard M795 projectile. It has just, as in from 2007, just been able to push that out to 25 miles using the hyper-expensive and still rather rare M982 Excalibur round. So, well, yeah, Bull's howitzers were really pretty good. Now his dealings with all those naughty countries, they came back to bite him. In 1980, he was caught by the powers that be covertly supplying his howitzers to South Africa, which was then subject to a UN-imposed arms embargo. This resulted in his prosecution in the United States, where he subsequently spent 6 months in prison. The prison stint, though, did exactly reform him. What, prison not reforming someone? Never! Indeed, actually, the opposite happened. In fact, it created a deep resentment within him toward Western authorities. He felt he'd been scapegoated and shunned, and this fueled his resolve to pursue his ambitions independently, even if it meant working with pariah states. And so it was that in late 1987, Bull, who by then had relocated his operations to Brussels, was quietly approached by Iraqi officials with a tantalizing offer. They'd purchased their GC-45s back in 1984, and having found themselves rather pleased with them, they invited him to Baghdad, expenses paid, to discuss potential collaborations. Now, for a man like Bull, the timing was absolutely perfect. Iraq was exactly the sort of patron that he needed. Wealthy, outside the Western sphere, and motivated to acquire cutting-edge weaponry by any means necessary. And for Iraq, Bull was the prize catch, the world's foremost artillery expert, a rocket scientist who could give them an edge against their enemies. Saddam's grand idea. So, when Gerald Bull arrived in Baghdad in 1988, he found a regime eager to think pretty big. Saddam Hussein had just expended countless lives and billions of dollars fighting Iran to a brutal stalemate in the Iran-Iraq War, which had only ended that August. In the process, he'd also built up the fourth largest army in the world. Yet despite that immense force, Iran's sheer manpower and vast-scale missile attacks had exposed the limits of Iraq's reach and forced a status quo peace. As a result, Saddam found himself hungry for superweapons that could help turn the tables. He also craved prestige on the world stage, the kind of prestige that comes from technological triumphs. It did not escape Saddam's notice that Israel, his arch-enemy, had launched its own satellite, the Ofek-1, in 1988, and was consequently edging into the space club. For the Arab world's self-styled champion, this was both an affront and a challenge. And then, well, in walks Gerald Bull, brimming with exactly the kind of grandiose vision that appealed to all facets of Saddam's ambition. Bull pitched the Iraqis on an updated version of his old dream, a space cannon that could launch satellites for Iraq and possibly all Arab nations into orbit at a fraction of the cost of rockets, while also launching ordnance at intercontinental ranges. Win-win. As far as pitches go, it was a compelling one. Iraq struck a deal with Bull and christened the endeavor Project Babylon, a code name invoking the grandeur of ancient Mesopotamia's wonders. Bull's contract was generous too. By 1989, the Iraqis were reportedly paying him $5 million a year, that's not adjusted for inflation, just to revamp their conventional artillery, with far larger sums promised for the Supergun itself. He was given near-free reign at Iraq's top-secret military engineering sites as well, including the sprawling Sard-16 complex in northern Iraq, where missile and arms development were underway. He knew his stuff, and Saddam knew that he knew his stuff. With his extensive contacts and companies throughout Europe, Bull also became a key node in Iraq's procurement network. This was at a time when Baghdad, flush with oil revenue and not yet under full international sanctions, was buying up advanced technology globally in semi-secrecy. Western governments were publicly embargoing arms to Iraq, but in practice, numerous companies and some clandestine agencies were quietly assisting Iraq, seeing it as a counterweight to revolutionary Iran. Bull's involvement in Project Babylon thus fit neatly into this larger pattern of covert cooperation. In Iraq, Bull had finally found the patron with the vision that he had always sought. Saddam's imagination was as grand as his own, and crucially, Saddam was willing to foot the absolutely enormous bill. And so it was that with handshake deals and millions on the table, Bull set about making Saddam's wild ambition a reality. The project was officially underway by the close of 1988. Building the Beast. The scope of Project Babylon was immense. According to later intelligence assessments, the ultimate goal was to construct a gun with a 39.3-inch bore, meaning the barrel's diameter would be as wide as a manhole cover. It would have a barrel length of at least 512 feet. To put that in perspective, such a barrel would stretch longer than a football field and a half. It would dwarf even the famous World War II superguns like the V3 cannon and the Schwerer Gustav railway gun. And if assembled vertically, it would stand 328 feet tall. This was essentially a building-sized gun, something that could only be assembled in situ, probably welded into a mountainside or supported by a custom-built structure of concrete and steel. As for weight, well, the massive barrel alone was expected to weigh 1,500 tons. Add support structures, recoil mechanisms, and mounting, and the whole assembly would tip the scales at well over 2,000 tons, equivalent to the displacement of a small warship. Thanks to its immense proportions, this beast could never be moved once built. It would be a fixed installation, likely embedded in a carefully chosen hillside in western Iraq. Intelligence later pinpointed a site in the remote Jabal Hamrin Hills as the planned location. The gun would also be angled skyward permanently, not steerable or elevatable like normal artillery. And if you're wondering what would come out of the business end of this thing, well, Project Babylon was designed to fire 3 primary types of projectiles: subcaliber kinetic energy penetrators, gun-launched rockets or GLRs, and potentially large conventional explosive shells. The subcaliber rounds, such as the S-32 projectile, were saboteur darts intended for extreme velocity and armor penetration, similar in concept to modern anti-tank munitions, but a whole lot bigger. The gun-launched rockets were multi-stage projectiles fitted with fins and internal propulsion intended for long-range bombardment of strategic targets. These essentially combined gun-launch acceleration with guided missile capabilities. Lastly, although not completed before the project's collapse, conventional high-explosive shells were reportedly under design. These would have been packed with enough bang to level tower blocks in a single shot. And don't forget, Project Babylon was intended to have civil applications too, in the form of launching satellites. When it came to that, Bull boasted to his Iraqi partners that his cannon would be able to put small satellites into space for as little as $5,000 per launch in 1980s money, a sum which is a mere rounding error when compared to the cost of a conventional rocket launch. Those are really expensive. If true, that would have been revolutionary, although of course only very rugged and unmanned payloads would have been able to survive such a launch. But before attempting to build the full colossal gun, Bull sensibly opted to create a working prototype at a smaller scale. This prototype? It was appropriately named Baby Babylon. Baby Babylon, though hardly small, its bore was 13.8 inches and its barrel length stretched about 150 feet. In real terms, this was a supergun in its own right, roughly comparable in size to the largest artillery pieces of World War II. By mid-1989, so no time at all really, Bull's team, which included both expat engineers and Iraqi specialists, had assembled the Baby Babylon gun on a test site. It was initially laid out horizontally and test-fired with high-explosive propellant and heavy lead slugs to gather data. Then, with those preliminary tests having been satisfactory, they repositioned it at a 45-degree elevation on a hillside to simulate operational firing angles. They had a very specific goal with Baby Babylon as well. The core premise, that being that if you put enough bang behind something, you can fling it off into space or into another country, was readily apparent, and that wasn't up for debate. What they were more interested in was the specific ins and outs of how one actually accomplished such a thing. The specific points of contention were, how did you even make a barrel that big, and how did you make it strong enough not to just immediately blow itself up under a full combat or spaceload launch? Certainly there was no tooling in Iraq, or anywhere else for that matter, that could simply pump out a 512-foot barrel in one go. So, Bull opted to have the massive barrel manufactured in segments, which would then be bolted together at the launch site. While this approach solved the problem of actually making the damn thing, it also created the very fears of blowing it up at launch, since every single one of those seals between segments was, as far as Bull was concerned, a potential weak point that blast pressures would just love to escape from if given the chance. As for how Baby Babylon performed in its tests, is probably the best way to sum it up, since the results were decidedly mixed. On the one hand, the gun did actually work. It could hurl a projectile hundreds of miles, with calculations suggesting a maximum potential range of up to 460 miles if everything went perfectly. On the other hand, however, the tests exposed serious engineering challenges. The enormous pressures and stresses in the barrel caused persistent problems with the seals between barrel segments, exactly as Bull had feared, with one test even resulting in a damaging explosion that blew out part of the barrel. Essentially, Baby Babylon revealed that building a supergun was not as simple as scaling up existing artillery. New techniques in metallurgy, machining, and assembly were needed to keep the segments tightly fitted under extreme pressure. Nonetheless, these setbacks did not deter Bull or the Iraqis. In fact, they viewed it as a solid win. No one expected an envelope-pushing project like this to proceed without challenges, so these problems simply represented engineering puzzles to solve on the road to a full-size gun. Meanwhile, as all of this was happening with Baby Babylon, the manufacturing of Big Babylon's components were in full swing. Not in Iraq, but covertly in Europe. Given the specialized industrial capacity required, Iraq's own factories just couldn't forge huge, ultra-thick steel tubes with the needed precision. Bull tapped into his network of overseas contacts to source those parts. Through front companies and third-party brokers, Iraq ordered giant miraging steel sections from firms in Britain, Germany, France, Spain, Switzerland, and beyond. For example, the critical barrel segments, each a thick steel tube dozens of feet long, were contracted out to Sheffield Forge Masters in the UK and a smaller firm, Walter Summers Limited. These companies were told they were producing petrochemical pressure vessels or pipeline parts for an oil project. In truth, the specifications, 39-inch internal diameter, thick-walled tubes, were unlike any ordinary pipeline, but the orders apparently raised little suspicion at the time. Other crucial components like breech blocks and recoil cylinders were ordered from firms in Western Europe under similar disguises. Even the special slide bearings that were needed to support the gun barrel were procured from manufacturers in Spain and Switzerland under the ruse of civilian use. The entire procurement operation for Project Babylon was a masterpiece of deception in itself and a testament to how globalized the arms market had become. Iraqi front companies and Bull's own connections channeled millions of dollars to Western suppliers. Drawings were often split up and labeled innocuously to avoid detection. More astonishing still, however, is the fact that for a time, this all occurred under the nose of Western governments. Well, kinda. Later investigations revealed that intelligence agencies like MI6 and the CIA were aware of some aspects of these transactions, but allowed them to proceed for various geopolitical reasons. A declassified CIA intelligence assessment from 1991 titled Project Babylon, the Iraqi Supergun, which we managed to find a copy of during our research, discusses exactly this at length. The document mentions how they were fully aware that British firms had been engaged from 1988 onward, but that elements in London and Washington viewed the supergun as a useful distraction that could be leaked to the media to cover for other, more strategically important covert arms deals. The reasoning was that these more sensitive operations would undoubtedly be pushed out of the news cycle if the media learned about the big, shiny supercannon that Saddam was working on. By late 1989, components for at least one Big Babylon gun were nearing completion. In total, the full barrel was to comprise some 26 huge sections bolted together, plus smaller segments for the chamber and muzzle. Each of those 26 sections alone weighed on the order of 20 tons. Both Bull and Saddam were dreaming big as well. With everything seemingly going well enough, they were actually envisioning building two Big Babylons, one for testing and one for actual field use. Going further still, there were also whispers of Phase 2 guns, aimable versions with smaller 13.7-inch barrels that were to be mounted on swiveling bases. These would have had a smaller range, of course, with estimates topping out at 621 miles. However, the fact that these would be fully traversable and thus aimable in all directions was deemed a very worthwhile trade-off. And speaking of trade-offs, there's one key detail and ultimately concern that we've yet to mention: recoil. In a normal artillery piece, this is handled by a recoil management system built into the gun mount, typically a combination of hydraulic cylinders and compressed gas reservoirs. When the gun fires, the barrel is driven backward by the explosive force, but instead of transferring that energy directly into the ground or the vehicle, it's absorbed, at least in part, by these mechanisms. The fluid and gas compress to cushion the blow, then slowly return the barrel to its original position. This system not only protects the weapon from damage, but also keeps it stable and on target, enabling rapid, repeated fire without the entire system jumping off the ground or tipping over. It's a fundamental part of what makes modern artillery practical. For Big Babylon, this was essentially going to be handled in exactly the same way, only bigger, with 4 gigantic recoil cylinders, each around 60 tons, being planned. Now don't get me wrong, in the same way you still get a bit of wobble with any artillery piece, these wouldn't exactly turn Big Babylon into a 22 pistol, but by all experts' accounts, they would have been perfectly sufficient. And then there was the issue of guidance, which we also haven't touched on yet. A shell shot from an immobile gun can't be aimed once it's in flight, so hitting any precise target, especially with a non-orbital shot, would require some terminal guidance on the projectile, which was a whole other unsolved problem. In truth, as one US intelligence analysis noted, this fact alone would have made Big Babylon nearly useless as a battlefield weapon in any traditional sense. It couldn't be re-aimed to track moving targets, would have had an extremely slow rate of fire, and the firing would produce such a signature, massive flame, noise, and likely a literal shockwave that it would be instantly spotted and destroyed by enemy aircraft after one single shot during wartime. Iraq already had Scud missiles that were far more practical for delivering explosives. However, pure practicality wasn't really the point here. Saddam and Bull were aiming for something far more dramatic: spectacle and terror. A supergun could fire projectiles beyond the range of any missile Iraq possessed, potentially even reaching low orbit or striking targets halfway around the world. As a one-shot terror weapon, it could, for instance, launch a chemical or biological warhead at a distant city with virtually no defense against it. This represented asymmetric warfare thinking at its most audacious. An immobile superweapon carries a certain doomsday mystique, even when it's not militarily efficient. By early 1990, Project Babylon had made significant progress overall. The Baby Babylon test gun, despite its issues, had proven the concept feasibility enough to proceed. Many of the Big Babylon barrel sections had already been delivered to Iraq via ship and truck, hidden in false shipments, arriving at Iraqi ports and being spirited away to the assembly site. Iraqi and European engineers were reportedly preparing the foundation at the chosen hillside, ready to start bolting the behemoth together that summer. In short, Saddam's Supergun was on the verge of becoming a physical reality. So, why didn't it? Well, to answer that question, we have to ask you to don your tinfoil hats, as it's about to get oh so conspiratorial up in here. A conspiracy unravels. Bull was brilliant, but dangerously indiscreet. As Project Babylon advanced, word began to circulate through intelligence circles. Iraq was importing massive steel tubes, and Bull was linked to a covert ballistic program. Even the name Project Babylon surfaced in intercepted communications. By late 1989, as we've already seen from that CIA report, the jig was up, and military elites around the world were aware of exactly what Bull and Saddam were up to. For Israel, the implications were unacceptable. Saddam's regime had already attempted to develop nuclear weapons before Israel bombed the Tuwaitha Nuclear Research Center in 1981, and now it was pursuing long-range delivery systems. A supergun, even a theoretical one, represented a real risk that Tel Aviv simply could not ignore. Bull, for his part, suspected danger. In early 1990, he told friends he felt he was being watched. Reports suggest he quietly approached US contacts about returning to the fold, perhaps realizing that it had gone too far. He may also have grown frustrated with Iraqi demands on non-payments and was exploring a way out. If true, that made him a liability, a man who knew everything about Iraq's covert weapons programs, suddenly signaling that he might talk. On March 22, 1990, someone, whether Israeli, Iraqi, or from another nation entirely, decided that he wouldn't get that chance. As Bull returned to his Brussels apartment, a gunman shot him 5 times in the neck and the head with a silenced .32 caliber pistol. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, just a body and a mystery. Officially unsolved, most experts point to Mossad. The method, timing, and motive all align with Israel's prior suspected operations, such as the killing of Yahya al-Mashad, the head of the Iraqi nuclear program, who was killed in a hotel room in Paris in 1980. Whatever the truth, Bull's death completely derailed the project. His Iraqi contacts were left reeling, Western suppliers panicked, and within weeks, intelligence tips began flowing to authorities. The situation came to a head on April the 11th, 1990, when British customs at T-Sport seized 8 enormous steel tubes bound for Iraq, all of them prospective parts for Project Babylon. From there, everything just fell apart. Iraq could no longer obtain the necessary parts, and without Bull's expertise, they lacked the specialized know-how to complete the project, even if they could somehow acquire the components. And with that, Project Babylon was dead. In Britain, Project Babylon became a major political scandal known as the Supergun affair. Major firms like Sheffield Forge Masters had been quietly supplying Saddam's regime, and documents revealed that government officials had been warned as early as 1988. Both the media and opposition MPs were furious, and they demanded answers. Legal cases followed, but most collapsed. Further damage came when reports surfaced that MI6 had known about and possibly even supported some of the exports. Eventually, however, with the arrival of new news cycles and fresh scandals to fill them, both the public and those in power just stopped caring about Project Babylon. The whole sordid affair fell into the history books with minimal consequences. Saddam, for his part, he denied everything, claiming the parts were for petrochemical use, but the evidence continued to pile up, and then Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990. The resulting Gulf War saw Iraq get absolutely steamrolled, and during the subsequent disarmament processes, UN weapons inspectors descended upon Project Babylon's half-completed, dust-covered skeleton and destroyed everything still left on the ground. Although, unexpectedly, it isn't exactly hard to find parts of it to date. Gorkat, the British government, was oddly generous in giving those parts that it had seized at T-Sport to military museums throughout the country. And so, when all was said and done, Project Babylon died with Gerald Bull, undone not by physics but by politics, bullets, and the unforgiving world of international espionage.